Did you go into this kind of detail and the kind of detail that was in the book about the outing of Plame and what you knew or what you suspected with the special prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald?
This is all consistent with what I told the FBI investigators, the prosecutors. I don't believe Patrick Fitzgerald was at my grand jury testimony. I testified, I think it was early February of, would have been 2004, in that, and what I knew, and all this information is very consistent with what I told them. But I did tell White House reporters when the revelations came out that Rove and Libby were both involved, when they'd said they weren't, that my hands were tied by the White House counsel's office. They said, we can't comment on this. So it put me in a very tough situation. I'd been undermined by these two fellow colleagues and senior staffers. And I told the White House reporters at the time that someday I look forward to talking about this when this is behind us. And I think they really knew that I was expressing my sincere desire to do so. And in this book, I go into great detail, every detail about what I know.
Was that a sort of warning that this book was coming? Did you know even that that was what you meant by that? When you were going to, you look forward someday to talking about it? Did you mean the book?
No, I wasn't thinking about it at that point. I mean, I was still at the White House, but as I left the White House, I think you need some time to kind of step back from being in that bubble to really be able to reflect on events and try to understand and make sense of them. Because when I went to work for the president, I had all this great hope, like a lot of people, that he was going to come to Washington and change Washington, as he had governed in Texas as a bipartisan governor who had 70% approval. It didn't happen, and I wanted to go back and look. Why didn't that happen? Why did things go so terribly off course from what he promised? He assured people he was going to be a bipartisan leader, a person of honor and integrity, restore honor and integrity to the White House. And where did things go wrong? And that's really the overall narrative in the book, but certainly the Plame episode was a defining moment for me that is a central part of the book.
That is what I found so useful at the beginning of the book, was this context of why it was, not that just you all believed in this man, but why you believed in him, what it was, and you just explained it, that background from seeing him in that sort of idealized bipartisan role in Texas, which he had not recreated, or certainly. Well, there's a little time left in the administration, but I'm not expecting some sort of great conversion where he's going to be a bipartisan president in the last few months. But did you hold on to that belief to the very end in that famous goodbye scene? Were you still thinking maybe he's suddenly going to turn into what he was in Texas? Maybe my faith in him will be restored. Was that the kind of rationalization that was at work?
Well, I don't think I held on to it till the end. When we came in, we got some bipartisan achievements accomplished on tax cuts and on education reform, education reforms that I really believed in and as part of his agenda. But by the time that the Iraq War started to, I think it's critical that in a time of war that you not only build bipartisan support when you're going into it, but that you also maintain that support. And to do that, you really have to embrace a high level of openness and forthrightness from the beginning. Because when expectations turned out to be unmet or improperly set, it came back to haunt us. And the president is not someone to willingly go and change course in terms of his thinking when it comes to, we made a mistake on this front. And so I think that at the time I was there, I started realizing that, or started thinking that, maybe Washington can't be changed. Maybe this is just the way it is, and both parties share all the responsibility. But no one shares more responsibility than the President of the United States to set the right tone and to change things. And no one has more of a bully pulpit to be able to do that. But it requires embracing candor and honesty to a high degree, particularly in this transparent society that we live in. And this White House was too secretive, or has been too secretive, too compartmentalized, and too willing to embrace the unsavory political tactics that are at the heart of the excesses of the permanent campaign.
We'll continue with Scott McLellan on that issue, in part the great disillusionment and the great question, why wasn't what was in this book written or spoken or shouted from the rooftops in, say, 2004? We continue with Scott McLellan's first primetime interview about his revelatory book, What Happened. First, as preface, more reaction today. The former campaign director for President Bush's 2004 re-election campaign, Mike Turk, emailed the HuffingtonPost.com to say Scott McLellan is, quote, getting savaged for saying what everyone knows to be true, adding people had high hopes for President Bush to bring America together after his election and after the attacks on 9/11. They felt disillusioned by the administration's adoption of the win-at-all-costs partisan mentality in this town. I think the bigger point of Scott's book comes from the lessons he learned while playing a part in the permanent campaign. It's an exploration of how that mindset can lead to some really bad choices. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Turk appears to be the only former Bush appointee sticking up for Mr. McLellan. Secretary of State Rice, while technically refusing to talk about the book itself, went on to take on its major premise, telling reporters in Sweden today, quote, you can't now transplant yourself into the present and say we should have known things that we in fact did not know in 2001, 2002, 2003. The record on weapons of mass destruction was one that appeared to be very clear. Speaking of clear, the reaction from Mr. McLellan's former colleagues in the White House could not be more so. His former boss, Ari Fleischer, initially slightly sympathetic, saying today, quote, poor Scott. Scott's about to borrow some friends for 24 hours on the political left who will throw him out as soon as they're done with him, and he's burnt an awful lot of bridges to people who really always thought fondly and highly of him. As promised, Scott McLellan is back with me here in New York. Those reactions, have there been worse? Are you at risk? Has it been worse than just nasty words?
Well, I think it's to be expected. It's certainly a little surprising how personal some of the words have been. But, you know, the White House would prefer that I'm not out there talking openly and honestly about these very issues. I felt it was very important to go back and reflect on this and openly address these issues, my time and experience at the White House, and what I learned from it, so that we hopefully can move beyond these partisan excesses that have existed over the last 15 years because of the permanent campaign mentality that exists in Washington, D.C.
Have you been surprised that most of the criticism has been personal as opposed to, say, refuting facts that perhaps you got right and nobody wants to talk about that?
I have noticed that. There are two things I would say with that. One, some of the people that are making those comments are almost trying to judge the content of the book, judge me and my motivations for writing the book, and they haven't even read the book. And the second, which you bring up, is that I haven't seen people refuting specific parts within the book.